Okay, next is the chemical formulas. In order to easily and conveniently discuss chemistry, we can use chemical formula. Chemical formulas are written by putting the element symbol adjacent to each other. Say, for example, if you want to write the molecular formula of water, then we know that there are two hydrogens. The two should be as subscript on the right side to hydrogen, and there is only one oxygen. But usually when there is only one atom, you won't write it as you won't write the one as a subscript. Okay, so this is usually not written. Okay, but there are also some compounds which have special names. Say, for example, if you take NH3, that's going to be water. So here are some common compounds which have special name. So water, H2O, which is actually called as dihydrogen monoxide, but water is the common name that we use. And ammonia, methane, nitrous oxide, nitric oxide, hydrochloric acid, nitric acid, acetic acid, sulfuric acid, carbonic acid, phosphoric acid. These 11 compounds have special names. Okay, now how do we name a binary compound? For a compound that has a metal and a non-metal. So basically, a compound can be made of either between a non-metal and a non-metal, or between a metal and a non-metal. Now, how do we name them? Okay, say for example, if it's between a metal and a non-metal. Okay, so you always put the name of the metal first and then the name of the non-metal. Okay, so let's take this example, sodium chloride. Okay, so what's the name for Na? It's actually sodium. And what's the name of this? This is actually chlorine, right? Sodium is the metal and chlorine is the non-metal that we have. But instead of writing it as chlorine, you have to replace it with ide. Okay, so it should be sodium chloride. And how do you differentiate between a metal and non-metal? Obviously, you needed to look into the periodic table, and as I've said before, as you go from left to right of the periodic table, the metallic character is going to decrease. Okay, and aluminum oxide. So this is aluminum and this is oxygen. So instead of writing it as aluminum oxygen, remember the non-metal should be having a suffix of ide, oxide. So it's going to be aluminum oxide. And this is going to be calcium nitrate. And remember, calcium is the metal and nitrogen is the non-metal here, so it should end with ide. So the non-metal should be ending with ide. And here are some other examples. So here are the non-metals that you can have. Bromine should be represented as bromide. Chlorine should be represented as chloride. Fluorine, fluoride. Hydrogen, hydride. Iodine, iodide. Nitrogen, nitride. Oxygen, oxide. Phosphorus, phosphide. Sulfur and sulfide. Compounds of two non-metals. So how do you name a compound which is going to have two non-metals in them? Okay. So you needed to pick the one which is more metallic, and that's the element which is going to go in the front. Okay, and the less non-metallic element should be written after that. Okay, so here are some examples. Now let's take the first example, HCl. Hydrogen is definitely a non-metal, although it is occurring in the left because hydrogen is an exception, and this is chlorine. So how do we name this compound? Okay, if you want to name this compound, you needed to pick the one which is more metallic and put that as the first name. Okay, so between these two, when you look into the periodic table, hydrogen is going to be to the left, which means it is going to be more metallic. So the name for this is going to be hydrogen. And then to complete the name, the chlorine should be represented as chloride. So the non-metal should end with ide. Okay, and we'll take this example, CS2. How do we name this? This is carbon and this is sulfur. Okay, so it's actually carbon sulfide, but when you look into the sulfur, there are 2 atoms in sulfur, so you always use a prefix for that, which is actually carbon disulfide. Okay, let's do this. How do we name this compound? Okay, so we need to define which one is going to be more metallic. Obviously it's going to be phosphorus, so phosphorus should be first, and then comes chlorine. So instead of writing, since that's non-metallic, you should end it with "ide." Okay, and since there are 5 chlorines, it should be phosphorus pentachloride. Okay, so usually if there is only one atom, you won't put a prefix of mono in the front. Okay, so you won't use mono in the front. But if it's going to be only one atom in the non-metal part, say for example this is carbon and this is oxygen, so it's actually called as carbon monoxide. So you'll only use mono when it is present in the non-metal. Okay, so here are some examples for polyatomic ions. So what is an ion? An atom or chemical combination of atoms having a net electric charge. Say for example, atoms, when they lose electrons or gain electrons, they form ions. Okay, there are 2 different types of ions: polyatomic ions and monoatomic ions. Monoatomic ions, they are going to have only one single atom. Okay, say for example, if you take chlorine, it's just going to be chlorine. Okay, but if you take a polyatomic ion, they are going to have more than one atoms. Okay, so here you have carbon, here you have oxygen, so both put together they are forming the carbonate ion. Okay, so there is a list of polyatomic ions that I wanted you guys to get familiarized with. And now let's see how we can name a compound which has a metal and a polyatomic ion. Okay, so let's go on to the first example. This is ZnSO4. How do we name this compound? Okay, we know that the Zn symbol represents to zinc. Okay, but you're going to take the anion SO4. Okay, for which you're going to follow this chart. Okay, so most of your polyatomic ions is going to follow this chart. Okay, this is the symbol for, this is the formula for acetate ion. Hydrogen carbonate is this, and sulfate is SO4 2 minus. Okay, so if you find an SO4, it's actually going to have a charge of 2 minus. Okay, and it's going to represent the name sulfate. Okay, so how we are going to name this one? Zinc followed by sulfate. And let's try to name the second one. We know that Na represents sodium. And what about this? Let's go to our polyatomic chart and find what is the name for the formula given. So it's actually C2H3O2, which is actually going to be acetate. So you go up here, this is going to be sodium and this is acetate. So the name for this is sodium acetate. And K3PO4, remember you won't usually put the prefixes for this. Although there are 3 potassium, usually the metals do not go with any prefixes at all. Okay, so it's going to be potassium. And what is this PO4? Let's go to the table, find what is PO4. So here it is PO4. Okay, PO4 corresponds to phosphate, and therefore this is going to be potassium phosphate. Okay, so it is so important that you know the names and the formula of polyatomic ions. Okay, now let's see how we are going to name acids. Okay, when hydrogen is combined with polyatomic ions, you're going to have different acids. Say for example, HCl. HCl is actually hydrochloric acid. And HNO3 is actually nitric acid, and this is acetic acid and sulfuric acid, carbonic acid, and phosphoric acid. Okay, and all this need to be memorized.